We're in Germany, so we want to start on time. Everybody still coming in, welcome. Hello, welcome to this talk. My name is Jossi Wolf. I'm a software engineer at Google, and I work on Jetpack Compose things, usually Foundation APIs. And today I'm going to be telling you about designing Compose APIs. And originally I said it was going to be 5 easy steps, but turns out they're not super easy, so 5 easier steps. The number of steps is also debatable, I think, but we'll see. So we're going to start off by me telling you a tiny story about an API that we had that I joined and I worked on. So we had this API called Swipeable, and if you've worked with Jetpack Compose, anybody, can I get a hands up if you've heard of this API before? Okay. I'm sorry. Right. So Swipeable is a material API for components that may be dragged or swiped between a set of discrete states. Sounds kind of weird. That's because it isn't. Swipeable is actually very, very useful. It's the basic API that powers things like modal bottom sheets, navigation drawers, swipe to dismiss, backdrop scaffold, and a bunch more components. So it's useful for anything where you kind of like have components that you can drag, and then when you let go, they move to the closest state, they settle somewhere. So how this worked was using a modifier, and there was also a state attached, a swipeable state. But more importantly, you had modifier that's swipeable that you used, and you passed it a state and some anchors. So the anchor points were these kinds of points where you'd essentially say, hey, these are the points that I want my state to settle at when I let go, when the gesture is finishing. So for example, for a bottom sheet, you might say, I place my bottom sheet at 0f, and then to make it visible, I offset it by minus 500 pixels or something. Sounds great, right? OK, why am I on stage here talking about all of this? Of course, there were issues. As always, you kept us busy. And more issues. Just a few issues. Just a few plus ones, plus 56, plus 28. It was a lot of issues. So of course we wanted to address this, and we wanted to address this in the best way possible, which turns out isn't super easy. Because we want to get things right, we want to think about what is the best way to do this sustainably. Where was the issue coming from? So you were using modifier.swipeable and passing the anchors. Now, when you're doing this here, you're passing the anchors in composition, which also means that the anchors actually have to be defined in composition or at least available in composition. And it also means that when those anchors change, you have to recompose. And that can be an issue. Why is that an issue? Well, if your anchors aren't completely static, for example, in modal bottom sheets, modal bottom sheet layouts case, we were actually taking the sheet height, and we were then, based on that, deciding, do we want to have a half-expanded anchor or not? And when you think back to composed phases, which is composition, then layout, which consists of measure and placement, and then drawing, and you think about where you would get that size and the height of the sheet from, that you get from layout, of course, right? So you get that from measuring your component, and that's only when you have the sheet size available. Now, composition happens before, so you're kind of like trying to rely on data that you will only have later on, which means that you will need to recompose. So this is bad or not great for a number of reasons. But in general, rule of thumb, it's always good to try to do work in one frame or in one pass and do as little work as possible. And getting some data from layout and then recomposing, generally a thing to look out for. So we had a couple of components that were using Swipeable. And out of those, a couple of those were using kind of like this setup of layout-dependent anchors where they would get the size of the component, measure, and then they would have the anchors based on that and require recomposition. Now, if you have used these swipeable APIs and you were seeing maybe animations getting canceled or stuff like that, that's where this came from. So this wasn't ideal. And so we made the decision to rework swipeable, and to kind of like try to address all of these things. Now, all of these things I was talking about are only behavioral stability, or mostly about behavioral stability, but then of course also reflect in the API. And today I want to be focusing mostly on the API, but I want to give you some context on how did we even get to working on this. Right, so let's start with what an API is. API, if you haven't seen that before, it stands for Application Programming Interface, and I think most of you will be interacting with APIs in your day-to-day anyway. Like a true Googler, I asked Bard to give me this definition, which I'm sure is totally legal, yes? And anyway, so API, essentially definitions and protocols for building and mostly integrating with software, right? So these are things that help you communicate with other pieces of software. That could be a library, or in kind of like a wider sense, you could actually consider most of the code in your feature code base, in your product code base, as APIs. This is something I heard somewhere a few years ago, and I can't pinpoint it, but Ash, who's over in the other room, probably also struggling on stage right now, was saying this: consider every line of code an API. Now, of course, don't do this religiously, but just mostly as a thought exercise, consider every line of code an API, and kind of like think about what that implies. So if you're maintaining APIs, there are a lot of things that kind of like go hand in hand with that. But most importantly, you really have to think about what you are exposing through an API, what parameters do you have, and how do you evolve that API? How do you change that code over time in a way that doesn't hurt everybody that uses that code, right? So you don't end up doing major refactorings every other week. Your coworkers are also your users, right? If you're working on a library here, you'll probably anyway know this pain of you're shipping a library, you're shipping an API, you're evolving that API, and then you have to maintain it to be backwards compatible and everything. But if you're working on a feature or product code base, I also want you to take away that your coworkers are your users. I've seen this a number of times where there were developers out there who were saying, well, it doesn't matter what quality of code, what the quality of the code is, right? Because nobody's going to use this anyway. No, your coworkers are your users. Of course, if you're not shipping this code as a product itself to anybody else, and your app is your product and not the code, you have much less restrictions on how you need to take care of this code. But it's still very, very important for you to consider code and API. Just go through that thought process and imagine yourself using your code like it was an API, and then see if you'll go, oh yeah, this is great, or if you'll go, I want to like go on issue tracker and angrily file an issue. Also, before we kind of like dive into exact API design, I want to call out there is no one way of designing APIs. In fact, I'm sure there are hundreds and thousands of ways, and none of this, what I'm talking about, is revolutionary. This is also not a general rule for how everybody in the Compose team works. This is an example of how I work, how I worked for kind of like the past year, and how some other people work. Right, okay, let's get back to Swipeable and what we had and what we decided to do. So we had modifier that's Swipeable, where we said, okay, we have some obvious behavioral issues that we want to address. And then also, with that, we want to revisit the API. So specifically, this part there with the anchors, pretty important for us to kind of like revisit and address. Step one of building an API. What do you want to build? Sounds easy? Yes? Does it sound easy? It sounded easy to me until I actually sat down and tried to define what I wanted to build when I started out with this. Now, we already had a definition earlier. Let's take that, the API for components that may be dragged or swiped between a set of discrete states. Discrete states really just means that when you let go, it'll settle somewhere. We can simplify this a bit. Swiped here is a bit unnecessary, a bit redundant. Dragging is what we will generally see as a concept in Jetpack Compose. Now, when you're defining things like this, it's really, really important to kind of like go back to the concepts that you already know. Swiping might seem like a thing that's obvious, I think probably every mobile developer has heard of swiping before, or probably most people who are using a smartphone have heard of this pattern before. But it's just not something we do in Jetpack Compose. So similarly, if you're maintaining code in your feature code base, in your product code base, or in the library, make sure to always come back to the concepts and the building blocks you already have. Now we can also replace this discrete states word with anchors, which just kind of like comes back to what we already had with swipeable. And then, why did we even want to do this in the first place? We said we want to have an API for components that can be dragged between anchors and that support layout-dependent anchors. So anchors where we want to know the size of the component. Right. Does that seem like a lot to read? To me, it does. And this seems like a lot to encompass in one thing. I guess the lesson is if you put your problem statement on one slide with a big font and it looks like a lot to read, then you should be revisiting that problem statement. Components should always solve a single problem, or at least you should strive for it, because it's really, really hard to address multiple things to try to solve multiple problems. And depending on what you're building, you can be more and less strict about this. But if you're specifically building components, if you're building a design system, this is really, really important, because the more things you try to address in one API surface, the more issues you will have maintaining that later on. Think about not maintaining that for a week or 2 weeks or half a year or a year until your next promo. No, think about maintaining that, or the people maintaining that in 5 years. Have some compassion with them. So let's split that up. Let's split this definition up. The rule here is take your problem statement and split your problem statement into components and split the components into subcomponents and building blocks until you have one component or building block and kind of like problem statement for each problem. This can be really, really hard to do, and it won't always be possible to reduce it down to just one problem. But if you strive for it, it'll give you a much better starting point. So we have our things that we want to build. In fact, one of them we're going to split up a bit more later. So we have an API for components that may be dragged between anchors. And then we want to also support layout-dependent anchors. We're going to get back to that later on, because now it's time to talk about the thing that developers do best, naming. As we all know, developers are the best ever at naming. I wanted to have one slide with bad examples from AOSP, but there were so many that I didn't pick any. Point being, spending time on naming is very important. I think most of us, if you've been working on Android for a while, have dealt with bad naming, right? You've probably seen some kind of weird M Hungarian notation 200 character variable name somewhere, and you went, what even is this? Spending time on naming is also just really important, not only for your happiness, but also for developers who are using your code. Again, if you're shipping a library, or just if you're working in a regular code base, anyway, developers will always choose the path of least resistance. Imagine somebody out there typing a few characters. They think, hey, I want to do this thing where I can swipe, or I want to do this thing where I can drag. Your API should come up within what they type. It won't always be possible, again, but it's a really, really good thing to strive for. And it makes it much more likely, finding a good name makes it much more likely that developers will actually be using your API, which is good, because that's what you want. And again, if it's really, really hard to find a fitting name, that's a really good time to revisit your problem statement and maybe think about breaking it down further. So we had a couple of names in the room floating around for what we were doing. So we had Swipeable, which was the existing name. We were kind of thinking about what is the correct name for this? What do we want? Do we want to just continue with this name? How major are the changes that we are going to make to the thing that we have already? And is it really okay to keep continuing the same name? So for Swipeable, we went, this is actually kind of weirdly opinionated and inaccurate at the same time. Swipeable kind of like comes back to like swiping, which again isn't as much of a concept in Jetpack Compose, especially on the foundation layer. Is more of a material thing, maybe, if it is. And also Swipeable doesn't tell you a whole lot about how it works, right? It's like swipeable, but what about the whole like anchor points thing? We also had another contender, anchorable, anchored, and it pretty much suffered from the same issues. It's not really descriptive enough. Tells you about anchors, but like what about the whole like interaction thing, right? So it makes sense to go for something that kind of like combines this. So there would have been anchor swipeable, or anchor swipeable, or anchor draggable, or anchor draggable. And in the end, through a long process, because we talked a lot about naming, we decided to go with anchor draggable. This is, I think, a pretty good name because it actually describes kind of like that you have a concept of anchors. It would be even better if you knew what anchors are in the first place, but maybe that's something that will be established over time. And then you have the draggable part, which describes the interaction. So this really applies to all code in your code base. Make sure if you're writing a function, just people should be able to understand and expect what it does just from reading the name. Right. Naming, always important. Defining what you do, always important, and really, really, really hard. So if you've done this part, which could take a week or it could take a couple of months, you of course want to build it. So how the hell do you even build an API, especially in Jetpack Compose? Before we look at examples, I want to specifically call out a few things. Long-term scalability is really important. What we're looking for when we're defining how we're going to build this, we're looking to achieve a couple of things. Number one, long-term scalability, right? Again, this comes back to in 10 years on Jetpack Compose, we probably have to maintain those APIs. So we don't want to like be looking back and be like, God damn, why did we do this like this 10 years ago? And it's really hard to change now. And this also goes for any code. This was one of the issues with the original Swipeable APIs with the anchors, which just very clearly did not scale well. It was intended for some use cases that we had envisioned, and then not more. Number two, consistency. Be consistent, especially across other components. In Jetpack Compose, this means we want to be consistent in the components that we build. If you're using Jetpack Compose in your code base, you want to be consistent with probably the patterns that Jetpack Compose offers, or at least you want to be very consistent in your own design language, in your own naming that you have in your code base. This goes back to developers kind of like choosing the path of least resistance, where they always want to go for, of course, the thing that's easiest to do, right? And if something is an unknown pattern, it will be much harder to do. So consistency is very important. Number three, encourage the happy path. So this means that you want your components to encourage the right practices and to disallow the incorrect usage. You really don't want your component to be able to be used in a bad way, right? When a developer is out there and says, oh, I tried to do this with the API, and we're like, oh, this is very obviously not a good thing to do. At the same time, we also have to ask ourselves, why was it possible to do this with this API? Is the API too flexible? Comes back to problem statements. Is it trying to address too many things? How can we make this maybe a bit more restrictive? And then also, what are the core parts of the API? It's always really, really easy, fairly easy. It's much easier, at least, to add code later on and to add APIs than to remove stuff, right? We probably all know that like to do comments somewhere in our code base, or the 10,000 to-do comments that go, yeah, let's remove this later on, we'll be fine, temporary. 10 years later, you find this comment, and you go, oh no. It is much, much, much easier to remove code. And I think this is a very important lesson, even though it sounds very simple. Start with the very, very core principles and the things that you want to build. Next up, this might be more of a thing that we do, of course, in the Compose team, but if you are working on a multi-layer design system, this is also interesting to you. Where does the API actually live? In Compose, so we had these swipeable APIs, which were living in material. And so we have this kind of like layering where we have UI, which contains like very, very basic things, like some basic layouts and interactions with the accessibility system, and all of the foundations for the whole UI system. Then we have Foundation, which are kind of like ready-made building blocks that you need to build an app with Jetpack Compose. So that's, for example, draggable, scrollable, lazy is in Foundation, all that kind of stuff. And then we have Material, which is kind of like this very opinionated layer, right? The material design system that follows its own set of rules that has very, very opinionated usage, and that's made for kind of like more narrow use cases. So when we were looking at swipeable, we're thinking, hey, like, is Material really the right place for this? Because developers were asking us, we want to build something without Material. We want to use this without Material. And so we investigated, and we actually found, yes, we can move this to Foundation. Now, exploring this, like, I'm not going to go into detail for each concept of how we decided this, but essentially we went and we looked at all of the concepts that we were offering, and for each of them we said, is this really a Material thing? Or is this an Android thing? Is this a Compose thing, a Foundation thing, or just the thing that we can actually offer? And that doesn't exist outside of the design system. Having a layer like this, having a foundation layer, makes a lot of sense, even if you're building your own design system, just because design systems will always be versioned by probably major versions, right? We have like Material, then we have Material 2, Material 3, whereas Foundation, we ship much more incrementally, and we don't have to rely on major design system versions to kind of like change things. One of the things I do want to call out is we did go and we looked at the defaults pattern. The defaults pattern is something you'll probably have seen if you've been working with Compose, where we offer a defaults object with, well, useful defaults. And defaults are exactly the kind of thing that don't do well at a layer like Foundation. Defaults are the kind of thing that are very much tied to a design system. So these kinds of things, defaults, make sure to always have at the correct design system layer. Apart from layering, one of the other things you actually want to think about, of course, is like how will you build this, especially in Jetpack Compose, right? If you're building a feature, if your task is to build a feature in your app, you probably have all of the patterns ready already, right? You probably have maybe a view model, a presenter, a use case, or whatever, some kind of data domain layer. And you naturally know, or for the most part probably know, what kind of patterns you want to pick. Now, if you're building UI components, which you might not be doing every day, then this will be very interesting to you. So in Jetpack Compose, you essentially have three types of things available that you'll usually see, and it's usually a combination. So you have state holders, which you can use to express and you reuse state-related mechanisms and logic. So for example, we have swipeable state, which kind of like contains all of the logic for, oh, when I like let go, I want to move to the closest anchor, that kind of stuff. Or it could just hold data. And then you have modifiers, which are very, very useful for influencing a node's layout or draw. You can influence where something is placed or how it's drawn. You can influence the accessibility semantics, or you can receive pointer input on a node, or you can read modifier locals, which are kind of like similar to composition locals, which is implicit data that's passed in the composable tree. And then, of course, you have composables, which is probably kind of like the most obvious thing. Composables are reusable blocks for layouts and themed components and so on. So how do you even decide what you're going to pick? Let's go back to our problem statements. So we get the API for components that may be dragged between anchors and support for layout-dependent anchors. For now, let's focus on this here. So we have a few things here. I said earlier where we're going to split this up a bit more, so let's do that. So we have the dragging part, right? We want to be able to, A, receive pointer input, and also then take that pointer input and do something with it. And then we have the anchors. We want to be able to support anchors. And kind of like finally, in between, we have the moving to the closest state when the gesture finishes. So we can split those things up again. Let's do that. So we have receiving pointer input, and then accepting pointer input deltas and moving to the closest anchor when the gesture is finished. Now, the first part, I think, is pretty, or the second part, further down the slide, is pretty obvious. Or maybe if it's not, now it is. This is all state-related logic, right? You have data, and you're kind of like doing something with that data. Maybe you're transforming it. So these are always like very, very good indicators that you're looking for a state holder. The other part, though, not as clear, right? Is that even, what are you going to use? A modifier composable? Let's go look at the state first. Let's prototype a really simple state. One of the other things you can always do when you're unsure is prototype something. Just write some code, see how it feels, and then you'll probably either go, oh yeah, this feels like an okay direction. I'm not super happy with this, but feels okay, or you'll be like, this is definitely not a good path. So let's do this. We're going to add some more code. So essentially having the two entry points we want to have, we want to be able to accept some drag deltas from the pointer input, and we want to be able to move to the closest anchor. We need to. OK, so state holder, good. But what about the first part, right, where it's not as obvious? How do you decide between a modifier or a composable? So we did have that slide earlier where there's already some kind of hint, but let's look at what if we were building anchor draggable using a composable. So there are quite a few things for why and when a composable is useful and when it's especially not useful. One of the questions is like, OK, if you're building this API and you're using this anchor draggable, OK, you'll wrap everything. Does this just like apply to the whole area of like both of the boxes? Does it apply to like the whole layout area? How does the anchor configuration work? And a lot more reasons. And anchor draggable is not really a thing. We only want to receive pointer input and forward it to a state. We don't want to be doing any layout or anything like that. So again, let's do the thing where we just like try things out. Let's try using a modifier, building a modifier. And this actually feels, if you're trying to use this, a lot more natural. You're actually applying the modifier to one node, which is exactly what you want to have. Your API usage becomes a lot more clear, hopefully. So the lesson here is always make sure to build something, try it out, and prototype. OK, so next slide is probably not very unobvious. It's probably very obvious, actually, if you've built something before, but I still want to call it out. So this kind of like iterative process is very important. Build a prototype, ship it either like as an experimental build or a snapshot build, use it in your own apps, try it out. If you're building a design system, right, of course, like just rebuild and try what it feels like building a feature with this. Get some feedback, and then iterate. We'll talk a bit about feedback later on. Iterate, iterate, iterate. I really want to make sure, put some focus on this. Build MVPs. And if you're not really sure about them, keep them internal. It's completely fine. This is what you'll see sometimes in Jetpack Compose, and what might be frustrating for outside users. You're like, why are they not making this public? God damn, I just want to use this. But there's a good reason. You want to be able to try out new APIs and check for behavioral stability without committing to an API right away. Because again, maintaining APIs is very, very expensive and takes a lot of time. Now I want to show you some prototypes that I had built for the new swipeable, because they were terrible, and I thought it would be really, really good to put that on. This doesn't look super terrible. This was mostly fine, just kind of like very complex, and you don't need to understand the details. I'm just showing you that was quite an amount of APIs, quite an amount of API surface to understand. This was the prototype for state. Well, this was actually kind of like the 1.5 prototype. And then I was also experimenting with the modifier itself. I shouldn't have called it anchored draggable here, because at the time it was called swipeable v2. But I want to show that we were just pretty much calling draggable and not doing a whole lot of work here. One of the important questions is, do you really need this API? Because again, maintaining code and APIs is very expensive. It takes a lot of time, and you really don't want to be dealing with code that you shouldn't have written in the first place. No API is always the best API, but if a use case is common enough, so if everybody was writing that modifier.anchor draggable code, even if it was just like 10 lines of code, fine, add it. That's a really good signal. I want to show you the second prototype. So we ended up having a state holder, swipeable v2, the best name ever, should have totally shipped with this. And except a couple of parameters was very similar to the first swipeable. We also had a modifier to swipeable, which you could use to detect the drag gestures and forward the deltas to the swipeable v2 state. And then we also had another modifier, which is called swipe anchors. This you could use because we wanted to have something, right? Remember the problem statements, we want to have something that supports layout anchors. And I can see some confused faces. And that is because that API is actually kind of complicated. And it's a lot. I'm not going to dive into all of the details of the timeline, but just showing like from April until like pretty much a month ago is what the whole process took from like first prototype to actually shipping something. A few iterations later, I want to show you where we ended up with. So we went from swipeable v2 state to having a nice name, Foundation API. It's called anchored draggable state now. All right, we decided on a name earlier. Swipeable v2, the modifier, is now called anchored draggable. It was like pretty much okay. Didn't change a whole lot about this. And one of the cool things actually about this is it's a very, very light layer. So if you wanted to, you could also just write your own modifier.anchored draggable. This is also a really good lesson. We're using this in M3 material-free modal bottom sheets, for example. Always make sure to write your APIs in a way with the layering that you can replace parts of it, and you don't need to have all of the APIs. Back to modifier.swipe anchors, my favorite API ever. So we decided to remove some stuff, like the anchors changed callback, then the possible states. And then we were like, do we really need this? And we looked at what this was doing, and essentially we said, hey, you know what? If we take this internal fun update anchors, which was being called from modifier.swipe anchors, we make it public, we can just remove the modifier. So also, again, a really good lesson, just if you find later on you don't need something, remove it, and a really good reason to experiment with code and sometimes hide it and keep it internal. So we finally ended up with anchored draggable state and modifier.anchored draggable, which is where we are now. One of the other important things, one of the final steps, is collecting feedback. I mean, you'll go and collect feedback, you'll build something and collect more feedback, and so on, and so on. But I really want to call out that your coworkers are your users, and your users are probably full of ideas. If you are getting feedback from your coworkers, expect to probably be getting a lot of feedback and a lot of different opinions, and you don't have to take it all in. You don't have to incorporate it all. Just make sure to take it all, write it down, and categorize it, and then see what's most disruptive to the API surface, and come back to it when you can. Right, 34 minutes, closing thoughts. API design is hard. I had this slide, and my coworker told me, well, it's not quite accurate. It's actually this. And we can probably keep going with this. It's really, really hard. So it turns out API design is really, really hard because you have to, well, try to like solve a single problem, right? You should be solving a single problem with the APIs you're building, but that's really, really hard. In reality, you're probably not always going to end up solving only one problem because you have to address multiple use cases, right? You'll like build something and then somebody else will come and say, hey, but I wanted to use it in this way. And this is not something you can know up front. Only over time you'll actually be discovering this, and that's fine. So components should not be solving too many problems. And again, there is no one way of designing APIs. Whatever your process is, you'll work on your process. I'm pretty sure in a year I'll come back to this and I'll say, oh, this was a bad process. Consider every line of code an API. Do this as a thought exercise. It helps a lot. And iterate, iterate, iterate. The first prototypes will probably always suck, but it's really important that you build them so that you have something good to build on and to go from. And you can still be very, very proud of them and build something awesome, great later on. So these were some of my lessons from designing Compose APIs in 5-ish, easy-ish steps. So thank you all for listening. If we do have time for questions, I'll be happy to answer questions or answer questions later on when you find me around the conference. Thank you.